Welcome, everyone, to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm very excited for today's discussion. With me, I have the great pleasure of talking with John Russon. Many of you know that John Russon has had a significant impact on my work and on the work that Dan Chiappi and I have done and published. One of his books, Bearing Witness to Epiphany, has had a huge impact on me. I'm reading his current book, Politics, Money, and Persuasion, which is his book on the Republic. I see John as doing something very interesting, something that Dan and I are doing a lot of work on, something like a phenomenology of intelligibility, trying to make sense of how we make sense, if that doesn't sound too circular. And in a similar way, John is bringing together elements from the phenomenological tradition and the Platonic tradition, something that I'm also working at length to do. And so, John, welcome to Voices with Vervaeke.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So, John, maybe you could say a little bit more about yourself and anything you'd like to bring to the table. And if you want to start on one of those two feeder topics I gave you, feel free to take it how you want to, in which direction you want it to go.
Yeah, I mean, so currently I teach at the University of Guelph, but I've taught at a number of places. I taught at Penn State University for 8 years, I think it was. And at that time, Penn State, well, I mean, as it is today, Penn State was a major department for continental philosophy in North America. So it was a very vibrant and exciting environment. And I think a lot of my thinking and work developed in that context. Mostly I work in phenomenology, but since the very first reading in the very first philosophy class I took, Plato has been at the heart of my experience. The first thing I read was Plato's Apology, and that has accompanied me through my whole life. And when I first read it, and still today, I think of it as the single greatest work of philosophy. I think everything is in it. So in many ways, I think my philosophical journey has been an ongoing attempt to think about and think with the resources that the Apology offers. So your remark about Platonism, I think, is apt. That really is my home context. And I think the reason that I was so drawn to phenomenology, or part of what my attachment to phenomenology is a sense that when I study the works of Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty, I feel like I'm doing very much the same thing I'm doing when I'm reading the Platonic dialogues. Exploration of the way our lives and the way the world is meaningful. And in the context of that study that begins at a very immediate personal level, like just trying to make your life into something or trying to figure out how you feel, as you start investigating that more deeply, it takes you into reflections on the nature of reality. Like when you start down that path, everything makes its way in. And so I think that the Platonic dialogues are extremely rich and also extremely rigorous in their treatment of all those themes. But because Plato writes in this very complex and challenging literary style, you can't just read the doctrines off the page. And so I think phenomenology is much more obviously a sort of manifestly sort of scientific discipline, not scientific in the sense that it worships the natural sciences, but scientific in the sense that it is methodical, rigorous, and so on. And so I think that phenomenology, in my experience, has been the method, the rigorous method that I have been drawn to and relied upon to explore the themes of meaningfulness. But in doing that, it has constantly been the case that whatever I learn from phenomenology, I go back and read Plato, and I find, that's what they're talking about over here. So my life really has been my philosophical life, and my personal life has been a constant dialogue between the rich, provocative character of the Platonic texts and the sort of rigorous study of the phenomenological texts. And I find they're extremely mutually reinforcing and invigorating. And that's where my work has been. And I'll just add one more thing. You mentioned those two books, Bearing Witness to Epiphany and Politics, Money, and Persuasion. And I've written a number of other ones too. Bearing Witness to Epiphany is sort of in the middle of a trilogy of books I wrote. The first one was called Human Experience, where I was really trying to study, starting sort of from childhood and family life, how we form our personalities, which turns out to be much the same as how we make sense of the world and so on. You know, so, right. But looking at those things, and in particular, trying to understand where adult psychological troubles come from, you know, what we commonly call mental illness. But that was Human Experience. Then Bearing Witness to Epiphany was the second one. And then the one I've written more recently is about adult life. It's called Adult Life, and it's distinctly about the rich range of adult experiences, trying to define what that is exactly, but then studying the domains of life that adults have to deal with, from, you know, emotional issues like courage, anxiety, etc., through to political, economic, family, intimate issues, and so on. So I just mentioned that because there are a few other books too, but I mentioned that because I think if anybody were interested in Bearing Witness to Epiphany, they might very well be interested in looking into that larger trilogy, because I really have tried to do something somewhat systematic over the course of my whole publishing career. Basically, it's taken me about 30 years, I guess, to write those. Anyway, well, that's me.
I'm certainly interested. So there's a whole bunch of threads to pick up on from that. Well, let's pick up on the trilogy. Sure. I haven't read Adult Life, but now that I realize there's a trilogy, I'm going to read it. I did see you give a talk at the University of Toronto for Youthsism. It was on my recommendation that they invited you, by the way. So
I had that suspicion, yeah.
And in there, at Youthsism, the University of Toronto's International Symposium on the Mind, that's what the acronym stands for, you gave a talk about adult life, and you particularly zeroed in on what is commonly understood as a trait, although I think you correctly argued that it's a virtue, and then what was at the core of the virtue was a very sort of Platonic motif. And this was that at one of the core virtues of adult life is maturity. And I thought what you had to say about maturity resonated very deeply with, you know, a theme running through Plato, which is this, you know, facing the real, turning towards the real. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I think that's something that is very, no doubt this is in your mind, it's something very pertinent for today's world, since we have so many avenues and venues in which we can turn away from the real and get at least a temporary reward for doing so.
Yeah, that's what you say is excellent, I think. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just, you know, so as not to go on infinitely, I'll say two things. One about Plato and one about the book that I wrote. You know, I think about with respect to facing the real, I think that's you're very right to associate that with Plato. And I think one of the things that's then so striking in Plato, I mean, you certainly see it in the Apology, Socrates, you know, before the court, but also you very strikingly see it in the Republic, and the talk about the divided line in the cave. Yes. That facing the real, you know, it means being realistic, but in the highest sense, it means recognizing the good.
Yes.
Facing the real in a profound sense means recognizing, feeling the imperative to be good, to be moral, to be a good person. So I think, you know, there would be many things to say about facing the real in Plato, but I think the sort of high point of that story is that if you're actually truly going to be honest, honesty is the word I like to use for, I think, the same thing you're talking about. Yeah. If you're really going to be honest about what's going on, you have to recognize an imperative to be good. And that matter of facing the real then isn't just, you know, an abstractly cognitive notion of acknowledging something. It is a life-changing commitment. Like it's like feeling that the nature of reality is not that it's an alien thing, but that it's something that demands of you intrinsically to your very being that you know, turn towards it and be good. So that's what the thing I take out of Plato as a real orienting point. What you said. And then in my book Adult Life, I am exactly trying to talk about the demands of facing the real, and there I really try to articulate what are the dimensions of the real that we do encounter as adult human beings? And there are, personal ones, like I start off looking at the virtues, courage, and sort of self-possession and things like that, as aspects of what it means to face the world, face the real, like that we have to develop certain character traits. But then, and further, a second one, I think this is probably what I talked about mostly at the University of Toronto, is that part of the reality of our existence is that we are aging and mortal. And so, another thing about facing the real is learning to sort of own up to what it is to be an aging being, and an aging being who is going to die. So that's the second topic. But then the third one, and I think this will come closest to the point you were making. The third thing I really focus on are the broader sort of dimensions of social and interpersonal life that are the reality we all inhabit. And, for most of us, the most immediate and engaging one is our intimate life, our friends, our family, and so on. So I study those dimensions of intimate life. But our intimate life is always contextualized by sitting in a social world that is also economically structured and, politically governed.
Right.
So I think that as adults, the reality of our reality, the reality of our existence, is that our life is structured and defined by relations of intimacy, economics, and politics. And being mature, being adult, means owning up to those things, recognizing what they are, and learning how to engage with them realistically. And so I think what you said is right, that there are all kinds of ways that we are invited and encouraged to trivialize, disregard, ignore, turn away from, these huge, meaningful dimensions of our lives, often for sort of short-term gratifications. But in doing that, what's really happening is that we are irresponsibly mishandling these things that are real dimensions of our life, our political involvements, our participation in economic system, our intimate involvements, and so on. So yes, I think there are many ways we are encouraged to turn away from those things. And what I've tried to talk about in that book is the way that trying to be adult, which relates to this Platonic notion of being called to be good, really requires us to understand and grapple with the intimate economic and political dimensions of our social world, in addition to those personal things I mentioned, like character and aging. And I've tried then to lay out, something about how those things work. So I've tried to do a sort of phenomenological study of intimate life, economic life, and political life, and so on. So yeah, so I think the thing you said is right on, and that's how I have been trying to take that up in my own thinking and writing.
So that's wonderful. That was very clear. So I'm first of all, I want to note something, and then I'll reflect something back to you. First, I want to note the way the relationship to the real is a transformational process, right? Which is very, and I don't mean this in any kind of criticism. It's a much more ancient approach to our contact with reality, rather than an informational relation where what we're trying to do is gather propositions. We have a more ancient proposal. No, we have to undergo fundamental transformations in order for reality to disclose itself at its depth, right? And so I think that for me is a very powerful thing. And then I'm wondering, what came to mind when you were talking was Murdoch's quote about love is when you recognize something else is real. And I was wondering, right? And of course, right? And Eros shows up, of course, in bearing witness to Epiphany. And Eros is, all through it. It's a defining feature, if that's the right way of putting it, of Socrates, and the transformation of the notion of Eros in Plato's hands as he tries to figure Socrates for us. So what role does love play in that process you're talking about?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, I guess if I could again turn autobiographical for a moment, I said that the apology was where I really got started, and that really fired me up, and that's true. But then right after that, we read Socrates talking with Diotima in the Symposium about Eros, and I thought that was the best thing ever. So it's also the case that The discussion of Eros in Plato has been, I think, the thing that I've been sort of trying to understand for my whole life and working. And so I've written quite a bit about it. I've got lots of essays. It comes up in lots of books. So it has always been kind of what I keep turning to say, like, this is what you really got to grasp. So yeah, I think Eros. There are lots of ways to translate Eros. You use the word love. Could also think of it as sexual desire, sexuality, something like that. And I think those things are all right. But often I like to think as a starting point for grasping what's sort of coming out of that Platonic study of Eros is just the notion of passion, in the sense that when you have a real passion for something. I think that's if you think of what it's like to experience a passion for something, it's this overwhelming attraction to something, but it's not an attraction to it where you want to use it or take advantage of it, right? It's an attraction to it where you think it's great. Like it's very much defined by it. So like, in my life nowadays, I have a passion for jazz music, and that turns out to be hard work. It's very demanding. I got to learn that stuff. Right? So the passion for it amounts to sort of submitting yourself to its guidance in a way, right? To initiating yourself into its reality. And then the other thing about passion is that it is also sort of fiery and all-consuming. So I think of that as the experiential character of Eros. And I think that one of the points then that Socrates makes in his conversation with Diotima, or maybe Diotima makes in her conversation with Socrates, is the better way to put it, is that that's the thing we commonly think about as sexuality. That's the sort of the place in our lives where maybe in the most sort of immediate and gripping way we experience that capacity to be passionate. And it's like sexual energy is in a way what's fueling those passions. And so sexual energy especially is about other people. And so in the symposium, Diotima really focuses on that way that our sexuality sort of grows and develops in tandem with our engagement with other people. And I've really tried to think about that link a lot, about the idea that Eros, or sexuality at its basic level in human life, is a passion for others or for an other. And so exploring our sexuality and exploring what other people are really, the same story from different angles. And it seems to me that within the context of, if you have a passion about your passion, right? If you, in the context of, honestly exploring your sexuality, not, which is going back to the thing about facing the real, right? That's different from just taking whatever immediate thing is advertised to you. Right. But if you honestly explore what's going on in your sexuality, I think that that is a thing that develops, and it does develop into these other sorts of passions. It develops into a passionate embrace of the human world, and so Diotima says, if you develop your Eros, you're going to care about virtue, you're going to care about politics, you're going to care about those things. That's on the path. And I think it's right, both that the healthy development of our sexuality will leave us into a passionate concern for those things, and also the sort of flip side of that an honest, a good engagement with politics and the rest of that really requires that it be rooted in that kind of passion that starts in our erotic character. So there are distant or instrumental or excessively theoretical or detached ways of being involved in politics that are all going to fall short of a relationship that comes out of that sort of lusty engagement with the human world. So I kind of went off in a bit of a ramble there, but
no, it's
that's what I think of.
Well, so let's discuss this a little bit, because this is a really interesting point for me. Because I want to get your thoughts on. Of course, there's sort of cautioning within diathema about don't get stuck at this level, right? It should scaffold you to the next, and it should scaffold you to the next. And I think of Fromm's warning too of modal confusion, that we can confuse being in love with having lots of sex, and therefore turn away from the developmental call that I think you're putting your finger on. I think those are very real possibilities, and I think Plato's picking up on that. But so I'm hearing, this is something I've seen in Plato too, that this way of responsiveness and responsibility have some deep, intimate connection with each other, right? And they sort of they co-define our responsiveness and our call to be responsible are bound up together. And I mean, of course, in the symposium, diathema takes Socrates up to, the beautiful itself. And I'm not going to try and get into the abstract elements of this, but what I see in there is, again, this Platonic notion that we do have a desire to be in contact, to be intimate with the real. Let me use an example that is within the domain of Eros. So I'll ask my students, I'll say, how many of you are in satisfying romantic relationships? And, romantic relationships are, for many people, the surrogate of God in our culture right now. And so they put up their hands. And then I say to them, how many of you would want to know that your partner was cheating on you, even if it meant the destruction of the relationship? And 95% of the people put their hands back up. And then I ask them, well, why? And here's all these, and they're all sort of jaundiced and post-Nietzschean and everything. And then they utter innocently, well, because it's not real. Because it's not real, right? And so they're like this, that they don't, right? Even though all of their desires are being gratified in one sense, and they can hear all the words they want to hear, the fact that it lacks this deeper dimension robs it of all of that call. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about that, because I hear in Plato that, and this is what Hahn talks about in the agony of Eros too. He talks about, ultimately Eros requires a vulnerability to the other. And I think Murdoch was picking up on that too. Love is when you confront something other than yourself that's real. It's like when the arrow of relevance goes from how is everything relevant to me to how am I relevant to that? And so I'm wondering what you think about that, about that there's a sense in which that call, the call of responsiveness that becomes the call of responsibility, also has a capacity to deepen itself, to draw us further and further along.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess I would say a couple of things. So first, I would say, in terms of people's, actual sort of empirical, practical sexual lives, there are lots of things people can do that can be, rewarding in lots of different ways. So I don't want to start off by saying, oh, you shouldn't do this thing exactly.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
But in that, nonetheless, I think it's true that we do have a deep desire for intimate companionship. And for there to be intimate companionship, we need to make ourselves vulnerable to that other person. And similarly, the other person needs to make themselves vulnerable to us.
Yes.
So in that sense, you could find out that you thought you had that. And then if you found out the other person had been stringing you along, then there's a way in which it wasn't real. There's a way in which you didn't get that. And so I don't automatically want to say, oh, you shouldn't have sex with people you're not deeply in love with. It's not that. But I do think people get themselves into relationships where there's a thing they actually want, which is this deeper thing I'm talking about. And they equate what they've got with that, but rightly or wrongly. And so that can mean a couple of things. It can mean they want that, but they don't really quite know what they're after. And so they go for the thing that they're told they're supposed to go for. So people sometimes substitute, maybe naively substitute really unsatisfactory relationships that look like the thing you're supposed to have for what is really a deep and intimate bond. And so that, I think, is an unfortunate thing that happens to a lot of people, that we don't like. That's why you should study philosophy. Like we don't automatically know how to make sense of our own feelings and desires. And so we do the things that look like maybe that's what I'm supposed to do, hoping they're going to fit. And often they don't. So I think that's one side of it. And then I think, so it can be that people sort of pick the wrong thing to fit their desires, or it can also be that people are sort of confused and bring the wrong standards to bear on what they're doing. But so lots of those things can happen. But I do think that the deeper thing is we do want and need, if we're going to be healthy and happy, we need intimate companionships. And exactly as you say, that requires the companions to really be, passionate about each other, to really be vulnerable to each other. And there's something, really unsatisfying and unfortunate about a situation that's supposed to be like that isn't like that, which is where you're being deceived, I guess. But it's also really unfortunate that people don't understand that about themselves, or are discouraged from understanding that about themselves.
Right.
Kind of put the wrong thing in place. Because I think there is a pretty big I don't know, propagandistic, I can't think of the right word, but pretty big sort of advertising effort to tell us not to take those things so seriously, So I think that the mismatch of the kind of relationship we develop with our deeper needs and aspirations, I think, is the source of a lot of unhappiness in people's lives.
That's well said. So I want to pick up on that. What about Plato's proposal that sense of intimacy and that sort of reciprocal opening between you and the other can move beyond people and to aspects of reality itself, and towards the beautiful? And I think this is actually pertinent to some of what is going on in bearing witness to epiphany, because one of the things I love about that is you shift the template for intelligibility off of math and do something that's really, to some ways, very Platonic. You shift it onto music, and you sort of unpack the musicality of intelligibility, how there are rhythms and there are melodies and there are harmonies in how patterns of intelligibility open up for us. And like music, it's not out there and it's not in here, it's both, and there's a resonance going on. So that, I think, is genuinely beautiful, not only in your prose, but in what you're referring to. And so it seems to me, and this is perhaps what Plato was holding out, that we could come to find the very processes. I'm not going to claim this is an adequate account of the forms or anything like that, but we could find these various processes of the disclosures of the beautiful patterns, the musicality of intelligibility, something that we could desire to have a more intimate, transformative relationship to.
Yeah. I mean, again, I also will try not to get too far into that, but I think at a basic level, I mean, I would just call that actually understanding. I think as we learn about reality, like, it's very interesting and we want to learn more about it. I mean, let's go back to math. You're right. I do think we shouldn't have mathematics as our paradigm for thinking what intelligibility is, but it has a place. But it shouldn't be the paradigm. But nonetheless, let's think about it. People commonly, when they study math, get excited about it and they want to learn more of it, because there's something quite like my son, who's almost 6, has been doing multiplication and division and stuff for a little while, and he'll say that, let's do some division, because there's something thrilling about having the fact that reality works a certain way suddenly start opening up to you, and he's in a some sense of the word, like, he's turned on by it, like he wants to do that now,
Exactly.
And so I think that's common. People who study math seriously, I mean, maybe they have practical interests, they want to work in, designing airplanes or something. I don't know. That's possible. But I think it's common that people study math because they think it's beautiful. They love the experience of working with these relationships. And so I think, I picked math as my example here because I think that phenomenon I've just described is pretty well known, pretty well recognized. But that same thing, it seems to me, is also true of what I would think of as deeper structures of intelligibility. And so I think, and that's really what comes out of philosophy. When you study philosophy, I mean, of course, you can study it because you should study it because you want to be a good person and so on. Like, there are lots of things to learn about that. But a big part of philosophy is also the domain that's traditionally been called metaphysics, right? The study of what the nature of reality is. And that's it's electrifying to study that. It's extremely fascinating. And so, you can, if you're in the wrong mood for it and somebody hands you the opening pages of Aristotle's Categories and you read about something that's predicated of something else and what a substance is and stuff, it can seem like the most boring thing in the world. But if you actually are led into that well, and the grasping the notion of substance is life-changing. Grasping that you need to have the notion of a substance, grasping the meaning of a property. Those things I think are, those are some of the biggest lessons I learned in my life, and they matter. They don't just matter because I want to answer a question about Aristotle. Like, they affect the way I think about every issue every day.
Right.
So I think metaphysics is, I think human, Aristotle says all human beings naturally strive towards understanding. And I believe that. And I think understanding means figuring out how reality is. So I think that there is basically a natural human desire to do metaphysics, So I think in that sense, it is part of our development. In the unobstructed development of a human being, a properly supported development, it will naturally be the case that anyone would develop an Eros for thinking about the nature of reality, an Eros for metaphysics. Wow. Because it's so profoundly meaningful and so impactful on everything in our lives to understand those things. Most people don't find themselves in that situation because, first of all, it's not well, actually, let me change that. Most people don't find themselves in that situation, I think, because both in our everyday social world and in our structured education, the study of metaphysics has been treated as a dry, arcane, trivial thing, And so if you're going to come upon it at all, you're going to come upon it in a really tedious context. And so there's only going to be a few people who are ever going to get there, and they may even be kind of twisted souls. Like in the book 6 of the Republic, they're talking about the philosopher, and they talk about what a real philosopher should be. But then they say, but in reality, the people that we call philosophers, like, they're either, vicious people who want to use arguments to take advantage of you, or sort of, weirdos, and there's some truth in that, some truth. Well, it's not entirely true, but there's some truth in that. But so I think that the structures of reality should be deeply, intimately meaningful and exciting to us, grasping them. And in my own experience, they are. My ability to interact with erotically with someone is really influenced by the fact that I've studied, substance and property and attribute and so on.
Right.
But as it happens, it's not really made available to people that's in an engaging way. My own experience of teaching is it's not actually hard to turn on that interest in people. But to do that, you yourself have to have that kind of relationship to it. Right?
Yes.
But I find it's not at all hard to turn people onto that. And so if I teach introduction to philosophy, like I always teach, like one of the things I commonly have taught is Aquinas's proofs for the existence of God, because, just as a a poster for metaphysics, like that's just a topic that
Yeah.
even if people know nothing about metaphysics, they're always interested in that question, and that's kind of the root into thinking about the nature of reality. So I think it makes a lot of sense to say the processes of reality are things you could have an erotic attachment to. Yeah, like when you first say that sentence, it sounds kind of silly, but if you actually think about what it means in the context of studying it, it's totally true.
So as a cognitive scientist, one of the things I do is, I study consciousness and cognition and transformations. And one of the things I've studied is when people have experiences that are called higher states of consciousness. And typically what's really interesting about those is this weird reversal that happens for people. So they'll have this experience often ineffable to them, but the way they most reliably talk about it is as the really real.
Oh yeah, right.
Right. And then what you see is the Eros, and it's exactly what we're talking. There is this tremendous desire, this drive to conform. They will start to transform their structure of their psyche, their relationships, their careers. And if you study, the reason they're doing this, right, is because they'll say, well, I want to be more in touch with that. I want to live closer to that. So they engage in this tremendous process of transformation. And again, and of course, and then, right, what I'm trying to point at is they might not call this metaphysical, what they're doing, but they're invoking the really real, and they're invoking it. And what's like, and just think about what they're willing to do, John. Like normally when we have these aberrant states, we say that wasn't real because it doesn't fit in with all of this. What they say is that was really real, and this is less real. And I have to try to, like the arrow gets, and you see this tremendous drop, and by objective measures, their lives do get better in many, many measurable ways. And I think that and the thing is, this is hard to get totally accurate, but there's reasonable estimates that 20 to 40% of the population can have these experiences. And so it's often the case that these people struggle to find the language that they need to articulate both what they've experienced and the aspirational project that they've put themselves into. And so I think for me, that's a way of disclosing, the point we're talking about here. There are certain experiences in which, for a variety of reasons I won't go into, a lot of the other sort of salient concerns drop away. And this concern for what's really real becomes paramount, but not as an abstract idea, but as a passionate call, a vocation. And so I think that that's also very good evidence for the kind of thing we're talking about. And for me, that helps to also make sense to those aspects of where Plato is describing this, like the Anagarge out of the cave, or the divided line, which get described as mystical, right? And because he's trying to articulate that, like, once you start making this journey and you start to get, as you said, an erotic attachment to these deeper aspects, it can sometimes draw you into some very profound transformative experiences.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things come to mind when you say that. One is, people refer to these things as mystical. And I wouldn't usually myself adopt that language. I think there's something right about it in the sense that, going back to your earlier point, people start studying things that they realize take them sort of beyond the terms in which they've otherwise thought about things, right? So there's something right about that. And that partially to call it mystical is just to recognize, oh, I got to change something, But then that said, I don't think there's anything particularly otherworldly in Plato. I think that the whole point of this is to appreciate more honestly the reality you're dealing with right here and now. And I wouldn't waste my time studying any of this if it didn't basically immediately translate into enriched engagement with this world. And so, when you said this thing about people's lives getting better, I think, of course, that's true. Like that's the only thing this is about, is appreciating more deeply and more honestly what's actually going on with you already. And
Yes.
so it's not about going to another world. It's about improving your perception of your own life. And in many cases, it's about correcting ignorances and misrepresentations you
Yeah.
already have about what's happening for you.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
And so, I really like, speaking of lives getting better, like I've just been making some lectures on YouTube about the Republic, and I just completed that with a lecture on book 10 of the Republic, talking about the thing that gets called the myth of And anyway, related to that, one of the points that Socrates ends up making is that, like he tells the story, it's just a story, but he says, imagine the Greek hero Odysseus were in the afterlife, and he got to choose a life again. What would happen? And he chooses the life of an ordinary man. And part of the point that's being made there is the thing that makes a life good or better. It's not more money. It's not more fame. Like those, you might or might not like those things, but those aren't the things that will make your experience of living better. What does make your experience of living better is, at the deepest level, trying to be good and actually becoming a good person. And then, all these things we're talking about, like developing a more honest, but for that reason, a more capable relationship to what's actually going on in your world. And that I think is the ultimate point of the Republic, is that all of these things we've been studying in the cave and all the rest of that, all of these sort of higher structures of reality that people might think of them as some mystical world beyond.
Yes.
Studies of what you're doing, with the result that the goal in life isn't to go elsewhere. It's also not to get rich. It's, Odysseus should be happy to be an ordinary person. Like the goal is to be able to do well at living your life. That's what it's about. And I my own belief, based on my experience of working with these things and living, is that it's entirely true that these studies make life a lot better. I feel like a very happy person.
Me too. We share that. I think of Ursula Goodenoug's contrast between the notion of transcendence as transcendence beyond, which Nietzsche, of course, savages and stuff like that. And she says, no, what she's talking about is transcendence into.
Yeah, exactly. That's great.
Yeah, and so that sense of, for me, and this is where I find Plato deeply phenomenological. Plato is a way of articulating how to get into the depths of my meaningful experience, and so for me, like I think this is the sense I'm getting for you. Metaphysics isn't about like arcane things, right? It's about those things that are like impregnating the very structures of how we make sense of our life.
Yeah. And that's why phenomenology is such a natural companion to this. I mean, you just mentioned phenomenology, but that's exactly right. Like, because that's what phenomenology tries to do. It tries to take sort of the living fabric of experience as it's happening and articulate its structure, articulate its structures, I guess, and that, which is exactly what you're saying.
So I want to bring up, this is flowing very beautiful, but I want to bring up a problem you pose. Now, forgive me, I've only started the book, all right? So there may be things you said later in the book, but this is just, but you bring up a problem, at least that's being posed in the Republic, and I think it's bang on. And you bring up the Greek word logos as this capacity for, taking into account, but giving account, responsiveness, responsibility, making sense. You use these terms interchangeably, and I totally agree with that. And then you bring up that there's an ambivalence, and Hyland does something somewhat similar in finitude and transcendence, but there's right, and Vellman also does this a little bit in the reflectiveness gap, but there's an ambivalence around the logos, because it is precisely our logos, our way of at least making sense, has some fundamentally different dimensions to it than what animals are capable of. Obviously, they're not completely unresponsive to their environment or anything like that. But there's as you rightly put out, we're in dimension, because we're cultural. There's dimensions of this that exceed what any animal is capable of. And then let's make it a little bit, sorry, this is going to turn out to be a little bit of irony. I'm going to be making it more concrete by talking about our powers of abstraction.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is like, so the logos has this tremendous capacity to put us in touch with patterns, right, that are of a more abstract nature. Think about how, as you do in the book, how, you know, money is in one sense a very abstract kind of entity, things like that, and that terrifically empowers us to sort of be able to fit to the world, belong to the world that we're in. But at the same time, it also has the capacity to remove us, to take us from. And Vellman, for example, in his work talks about like Hamlet as the prototypical example of someone whose logos just abstracts him so much from the situation that his agency is dulled. People around him are going mad and dying, and he's in some sense even sort of indirectly causing that. And so I see you as really picking up on that tension around the logos. And I wanted to know what your thoughts are about that. Like I said, you probably address it in the book.
Yeah, that's the book. Yeah.
Yeah. But it seems just apropos to bring it up right now where we are in the conversation, because we've been sort of talking about this and rightly so, the beauty of this, the depth, the eros, the attachment, the transformation. But there's also this problem, if I can put it. There's this tension, this issue that's also fundamental to the very structures by which we make sense. So I think we, in order to be responsible, should address the problematic aspect of this.
Yeah, that's great. There would, of course, be lots to say about that, but I'll try to be succinct. Well, we were talking already about this idea that, you know, our lives are going to get better if we try to understand the reality of our world and so on. And so, you know, at least one level, what that means is understanding, you know, what kind of thing we are, you know, what it is to be an experiencing being.
Yeah. And
so that is part of metaphysics. I mean, that's part of this study we've just been talking about, is understanding a certain kind of reality, but it's also sort of autobiographical. Like, it's the study of ourselves, what kind of thing we are. And when you're talking about logos, it seems to me that's the core of that answer, right? There's a basic way that we to understand ourselves, we have to understand that we are that kind of being that goes around taking account of things.
Yes.
And
yes.
So on the one hand, that you could think of that as a power in the sense that we can take account of things. That's right.
Yeah.
But you could also think of it as a limitation in the sense that we can't not take account of things.
Yes.
And so that's us. Like, we're doing that. We're figuring stuff out, whether we like it or not.
Yes.
One of the things that's so valuable about learning that about ourselves is, I'll come back to that sentence. Let me just say, we're taking account whether we like it or not, but we can be better or worse at that.
Yes.
And so partially, going back to the theme of sort of metaphysics and philosophy, but from a different angle, studying things like metaphysics and whatever else, or studying philosophy in general, if it's done well, should help us to take account better.
Yes.
And ideally, in the long run, grasping about ourselves what our reality is should help us to deal with ourselves in that situation better. So that's kind of a kind of formal structure and now I want to say something a little bit more concrete about that. We are beings with logos, which means we are always running around taking account of things. And that means the way we live is based on the sense we kind of harvested from the world around us.
Yes.
And the fact is, we often can do a pretty poor job of that.
Yes.
And so we think what we're doing makes sense. We think this is the right way to respond to this situation. We think this is what's happening, and we can be wrong on every one of those accounts because we don't get any direct input of truth about the world. Everything we do is a matter of us engaging with it and sort of shaping what's happening in our experience. And if we're weak in our abilities to do that well, we live out of a very twisted sense of what's happening in the world. We can live with a very twisted sense of the impact of our own actions, and so because we don't understand stuff well, we're unhappy because what we do and what we interact with is actually working one way, but we're understanding it a different
right.
Results don't come out well. So, just going back to the remarks about sex and Eros and romance, like I was saying there, like we can fail to understand our real need for intimate companionship, and think that, oh, the way to get that thing people need is to, hook up arbitrarily with somebody on Tinder or something. And then turns, that's doesn't mean you should never hook up arbitrarily with someone on Tinder. But if you think that's the thing that's going to satisfy your intimate, you're going to be wrong. And people do make that mistake. And that that doesn't happen to, I don't think that happens to a cow or a cat, because they're not the ones that, they don't come with that demand to sort of make sense of their experience in the same way. Like they have instincts. Their cows are going to know how to mate with cows and so on. But people have this thing where everything that's going to happen has to go through our little processing system, which is our logos. And if we don't handle it well, we tie ourselves up in knots. So I don't think there's any way out of that. I don't think we're ever going to correct that situation. That is the human condition.
Right.
And so you were referring to the ambivalence and the problem of logos that I talk about in that book. Well, that's what I'm trying to get at here. The ambivalence of logos is we have the capacity to make sense of things, but it's also the curse to have to make sense of things.
Right.
And we're going to be stuck in our lives with having to live with our way of making sense of things. And if we're not very good at it, we're going to be designing poor and unhealthy lives for ourselves. So there's no way to fix that problem in the sense that that's just the human condition. But what that points to is the profound need for human beings to get good at taking account, get good at using their logos. That's what we live by. And you're weak at living by your logos, you're going to have a crappy life. But that's why we need to study, So I think that gets to what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful, that's a beautiful apology in the ancient sense for philosophy, right? At least in Hadot's sense of philosophy as a way of life, and not just the technicalities of argumentation. So that's interesting. It's like we clearly see responsiveness in animals. We see some perhaps responsiveness beginning to be responsibility, especially in mammals, the parental role, things like that. And then even more so in primates. Greg Enriquez makes a lot about this progression. But there's something about us, about and I hear you sort of articulating this phenomenology. It's like the call to responsibility makes us push our responsiveness much more deeper than animals. And simultaneously, because we can push our responsiveness and really, penetrate to the depths of reality, the call to be responsible is also increased. So there's this sort of this reinforcing loop there. And so I hear you saying, not knowing about that or misapprehending it or failing to, I'll use Frankfurt's term, failing to take it seriously, can be a root cause above and beyond particular ways in which you mess up your life. This can be a root cause of how your life can go astray in a fundamental way. Is that so? I'm hearing you correctly?
Yeah, that's right. And we've actually now got to the point of all my books, right? This is what all my books are about. They're about trying to understand our distinctive reality as beings with logos,
right?
And trying to look at the concrete ways as we live our lives, from children to adolescents to adults and all the rest, the concrete ways we are engaged with that issue of making sense of things. And I try to show, here are the issues that are at stake. Here's how you can do it. Here are things that can go wrong. Here are the things you have to take account of. And so, I am trying in those books, again, you said an apology for philosophy. That's also exactly right. I'm trying in those books to be doing my version of, teaching philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where doing that is exactly the same as understanding the issues people face in their lives of, how to make sense of things and showing how you can go astray. So this conversation has really, in this last point, especially as you were articulating it, has really brought us back to what all of that writing is about.
Well, this seems like a good place to bring it to a close. Then that's a very good, a very virtuous Platonic circle we've circumambulated. So that's John. I really want to thank you for coming on. This has been a fantastic dialogue. I felt like we were really finding a wonderful through line, and things were unfolding and mutually. And I always like to give my guests sort of the last word. Any last thing you'd like to say before we bring it to a close?
No, I mean, I guess just I would like to second that. I thought it was delightful talking with you. I hope we'll do it again sometime.
Yes,
and
I would like that.
I also, I mean, I hope if people are interested, I hope they will look up some of my stuff. The books. They might also check out the YouTube lectures. Because I'm passionate about this stuff, and I really hope my work will have something to offer people. So, but it's been great talking with you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Dan, I've watched a couple, but Dan Chiappi, my colleague. He's a psychologist at the University of California. He is a big fan of your YouTube, and if he were here, he'd hardly also recommend. He thinks your online lectures are beautiful.
Great.
So I trust him. He's a dear friend, and we've been working together for years. So on his recommendation, I can heartily recommend your books, and I'm going to go out and get at least Adult Life because this has just been wonderful. And I think everybody who's watching John can clearly see his passion. I'm going to ask John to send me any links to put in the notes for this video. And I would very much, John, like to talk with you again. So I hope we can talk again. Maybe you can come on Voices with Vervaeke again, or if you'd like me to come on your channel, whichever. I'd be happy to do either. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you.